If it's Wednesday, debt limit dysfunction at home and perils America standing abroad. The president embarks on a key trip to Asia that has been cut short as he tries to rally U.S. partners in the region and counter China's growing global influence. Plus, upsets, winners, losers, and lessons. What last night's election results out of Kentucky, Florida, and Pennsylvania tell us about the biggest political races of 2023, as well as some hints on the biggest race of all, the White House in 2024. And battleground abortion brawls and bans. North Carolina Republicans override their Democratic governor's veto and enact a 12-week abortion ban, becoming the latest state in the South to roll back access in post-Roe America. Happy Wednesday and welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd reporting in Washington, where for the first time talks on the debt ceiling seem to be heading in the right direction ahead of the looming June 1st deadline, at least if you believe Wall Street and watch the stock market today. But policy progress at home has come with a cost for the U.S. abroad. Let me explain. With Washington scrambling to avert a potentially catastrophic government default, top congressional leaders are finally hinting at some progress following yesterday's White House meeting with the president. Last night, the newly designated White House negotiators met with Speaker McCarthy's team in an effort to hammer out a deal. It is just those two entities talking right now. No more input from the senators, the two Senate leaders, or Hakeem Jeffries. This is Biden and McCarthy. Speaking to reporters before departing for a previously scheduled trip to Japan, President Biden struck an optimistic tone about the state of the talks.
I'm confident that we'll get the agreement on the budget, that America will not default. To be clear, this negotiation is about the outlines of what the budget will look like, not about whether or not we're going to, in fact, pay our debts. The leaders have all agreed we will not default. Every leader has said that.
Biden also signaled he may be open to some concessions, saying that he would not accept work requirements that will impact people's medical needs. But he was very specific with that. It is possible there could be other work requirements. House Speaker McCarthy, meanwhile, is criticizing Biden for being out of the country during these crucial negotiations, even after the White House decided to cut the trip short, canceling stops in Papua New Guinea and Australia.
Mr. President, stop hiding. Stop traveling somewhere else. America wants an American president focused on American problems, finding American solutions. We have them here for you.
But on this point, the Republicans are not united. People like Senator Lindsey Graham actually say Biden was right to make this trip. China matters here, folks. Those canceled stops I mentioned come at a time when the administration is trying desperately to revive America's pivot to Asia. China continues its own diplomacy in the region, and it contests America's influence in the Pacific. It grows increasingly combative with the West, so cutting this trip short appears to be both a missed opportunity for the U.S. and a diplomatic setback that Beijing will likely embrace. In Papua New Guinea, expectations were so high for this trip. It would have been the first visit by a sitting U.S. president to any Pacific island nation. The country had declared a public holiday in anticipation for this historic visit. And we weren't there to just sort of say hi. This is about China and basing. You know what this is about. And in Australia, local media is calling the cancellation an 11th hour snub. Now, these clashing foreign and domestic priorities can seemingly be traced back to an assumption made by the Biden White House, which at the time seemed like the right one, that Speaker McCarthy would not be able to get his own caucus in order on its debt limit demands, and the administration could force a clean debt ceiling increase. Instead, Biden's bluff was called by McCarthy, who pulled off what many people thought was not possible. And he's forced Biden to the negotiating table. So, yes, he heads overseas on shaky ground, with some allies raising questions about America's resolve and staying power. So joining me now is our chief White House correspondent, Kristen Welker. She is in Hiroshima, Japan, where President Biden is attending the G7. And also with me is Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill. So, Kristen, let me start with you. Look, I think the big reason why many of us in this town and many people see that there's light at the end of this debt ceiling tunnel is the inclusion of Steve Ricchetti in these talks. He is the White House aide that every Republican in Capitol Hill likes to deal with. His inclusion does feel like this means a deal is imminent.
Chuck, you're absolutely right. Think about it as the heavy hitters coming in, the closers. Steve Ricchetti, one of President Biden's longest serving aides and allies, and someone who does have those relationships on Capitol Hill. And Shalonda Young, who's, of course, the OMB director, someone who has been engaged in these types of talks going back years. She has a long history on Capitol Hill as well. And so you're absolutely right. The fact that these two engaged, along with Larissa Terrell, who's, of course, the Legislative Affairs Director, is a sign that progress is being made. The question becomes, where is that common ground? We know that areas of potential common ground, clawing back COVID relief funds that have been unspent, dealing with some other unspent funds. But the fact that President Biden cracked the door open just a tiny bit today, Chuck, to the possibility of some type of compromise on the thorny issue of work requirements was significant as well. You're right. He said, we're not going to deal with health care, but the possibility of SNAP, food assistance, housing assistance, for example. So there could be some compromise around those very thorny issues. Now, obviously, a key challenge for the president is going to be to stay engaged in the talks back at home once he arrives here in Japan, and then to also reassure, as you said, allies here, Chuck, that not only is the U.S. economy stable, not only will this crisis at home be resolved, but that there is a commitment to doing what they set out to do, countering China, for one, Chuck, and dealing with Ukraine as well.
Kristen, I want to look. I had talked to somebody pretty close to this West Wing who admitted, look, they said basically we made a bet that McCarthy couldn't unite his caucus. He united his caucus. We're stuck with having to negotiate. That it was that black and white. Is there any regret on how they handled this, or at the end of the day, that was a bet worth making?
Well, I think they believe at the time it was the most realistic bet to make. But there is no doubt, Chuck, that they were caught off guard when House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was able to raise the debt limit. And so you're absolutely right. This has changed the dynamics of the game. And now there are just 15 days left to get something done. And so with that looming deadline, the pressure's on all sides. That's part of why the president canceled his trip. He also canceled his trip, Chuck, because remember, when he was in Ukraine and Poland last time, you had that crisis in East Palestine. So that's in the backdrop as well of his decision to cancel part of this trip, even though it is creating diplomatic ripple effects here across the globe.
Well, we shall see. Very quickly, Kristen, I know there's usually an APEC trip, the Asian Pacific Economic Conference, that happens later in the year. Could we see a reschedule of Papua New Guinea for then and Australia?
Look, absolutely. I think the White House has put the possibility on the table that they want to reschedule these stops for all of the reasons that you laid out. So that is certainly a time frame when we could potentially see those stops added. And again, just to underscore this point, Chuck, China looms so large over all of these issues, the mounting aggression, not only when it comes to issues like Taiwan, but the way in which they're dealing with Russia's war in Ukraine and the economy. So look for some strong language this week about China, Chuck.
I'm sure. Kristen Welker traveling with the president, actually ahead of the president. He's in the air right now in Hiroshima. Kristen, thank you. Let me move over to Capitol Hill and the Speaker McCarthy side of things. And, Allie, I find this interesting, the public stance Speaker McCarthy is taking. He downplays the optimism. It feels like he doesn't want to make it seem as if they're close. Is this all about how he's trying to sell this to his more recalcitrant members? Is this a posture, a public posture he has to have in order to reluctantly agree to whatever they end up agreeing to?
Yeah, I think that's right, Chuck. At least the way that I'm reading it and my sources are reading it is that regardless of the state of these negotiations, McCarthy has to make this seem palatable to his conference and also somehow make it seem like a win, like Republicans were leading the way on this. I think you and Kristen are both right that I've heard from sources here who said that the White House was caught flat-footed when McCarthy was able to pass that through his conference. And look, we watched him cajole member by member trying to get the votes that he needed in order to pass that because he knew it would give give him more leverage in these negotiations. Again, the White House now having to deal in that reality. But I think that when we think about how the House Freedom Caucus, for example, might be reacting to some of these negotiations, McCarthy is in regular conversations with them. But more important than that, the man who he's deputized to lead the conversations with the White House now, Congressman Garrett Graves, who has become a really close member of McCarthy's inner circle. I was just talking to someone about the role that he could play here. And this is a man who has been leading the so-called meeting of the five families here on Capitol Hill for months already. He's built goodwill. And what one person said to me, one member was like, he's just a good straight shooter. He has no hidden agenda. That could be exactly the kind of broker that McCarthy needs, both in the room with the White House, but especially in the room with his members, to make sure that everybody stays on board.
You know, it's fascinating that he's from the same state as Scalise. We know McCarthy and Scalise are not tight. Maybe they're not always at odds, but they're not tight. And I think Garrett Graves has had to deal with the far right at times, too, correct? So he really is sort of, he does seem to have experience being different flavors of the Republican conference, shall we say.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And he has goodwill with them, too. I mean, I talked to Congressman Scott Perry, one of the usually more vocal members of the Freedom Caucus, the other day. And I said, do you feel comfortable just letting McCarthy continue to lead the way on this? And he completely dismissed the notion that he would feel any other way out of hand. He said, yep, we're regularly being briefed. We're regularly in conversation. So the regular agitators are kind of not agitating right now, Chuck. But what we're watching from McCarthy, and I think is striking, is Biden has always said he's optimistic. McCarthy, though, has continued to throw cold water until this morning, until yesterday after the meeting, when he at least admitted that the talks were at least productive, even though he's still partisan posturing.
Very quickly, because we saw Ron DeSantis didn't know how to declare victory on Disney, and he ended up creating a defeat even after he won a fight. Does McCarthy, I mean, he's won here a lot already. Does his conference get that, or does he have to is he going to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat if he's not careful?
Look, that's always an option around here, and I certainly never say never for either party when they're in a position of looking like they could win and then immediately scoring an own goal. So we'll see if that ultimately ends up happening. I will say, to the extent that it feels like the Freedom Caucus can take a dose of reality, they seem to have taken a dose of reality on this, realizing that they have gone as far to the right in these negotiations as they're going to be able to get, and now they're just letting the process play out. All
right, Ali Vitale on Capitol Hill for us. Ali, terrific reporting. Thank you. Let's dive deeper into what all this means and the sort of the relationship between these debt ceiling talks and really the issue of China and the increasingly combative China. Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi is a Democrat from Illinois. He's the ranking member on the House China Select Committee. It's a rare solo appearance. Normally he and the chairman there, Mike Gallagher, do try to stick together on these things, but I know you guys can't be everywhere at the same time. Congressman, thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much, Chuck.
And I know you have a primetime, your second primetime hearing tonight on the issue of that dovetails with the G7's focus, which is this economic coercion is what the G7 is calling it. I know you guys are talking about it. But let me start with the impact of the debt ceiling talks and the fact that we're canceling a trip to Australia and canceling a trip to Papua New Guinea. This, you know, how much of a setback do you see it when it comes to our, you know, both visits were about China?
It's not much of a setback. As the Australian Prime Minister mentioned, many of these players were going to be at the G7 anyway, and so we'll be able to have these discussions regardless of whether he visits Australia or not. That being said, I think that these visits will get rescheduled for later in the year, and so it's going to be important to have those visits because at the end of the day, our alliances, our partnerships, our friendships in the region are extremely important with regard to our strategic competition with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party.
Do you think, you know, I want to put up an op-ed here. Three of your Democratic colleagues wrote in The Hill today. And it was about the debt. It was about this debt limit and its impact with our relationship vis-a-vis China. It's Andy Kim, Jake Auchincloss, and Brendan Boyle, and they write this. Nothing would be more devastating to the United States' global leadership or more helpful to China's ambitions than unleashing an economic catastrophe by defaulting on the Treasury's debt. January 6, 2021 was Xi Jinping's best day in office. Make no mistake, he's now watching how we handle our economy with similar bated breath. Is that alarmist or is that accurate?
I think it's accurate. I think that Xi Jinping and others are rooting for a default on America's debt because at the end of the day, they want to undermine the U.S. dollar. They want people to go toward using perhaps the renminbi or some other currency. Now, the problem for the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party is that there's no real rule of law governing the use of their currency. And so it's very unlikely that foreign investors are going to place any bets on the RMB. However, all that being said, we should never, ever be in a situation where the full faith and credit of the dollar is questioned. And therefore, it's vital that we not default on our debt, we pay all of our obligations, and we move forward.
Tonight's hearing, you're focusing, like I said, on sort of the economic relationships that we have or shouldn't have with China. You're going to have former President Trump's top trade official, Ambassador Lighthizer, Google CEO Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, and Roger Robinson, a former chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Let me ask it this way. Do you think are we headed to a place where we are going to discourage most economic ties to China?
No, I don't think so. I think we're headed is we're going to be de-risking supply chains that are overly dependent, perhaps, on items that come from the PRC. I think that we're also going to have to invest in our own economic competitiveness and up our game. That means making sure that our workforce is prepared to innovate and lead in technologies of the future, that we attract the best talent from around the world to help maintain our leadership, and also that we are ready for being able to compete in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robotics, and other areas where the Chinese Communist Party seeks to lead. And so I think we're going to have to do all of those things in addition to de-risking some of our supply chains and, of course, protecting our interests abroad.
Look, one of the things they've been highly successful at building allies is the Belt and Road Initiative. G7 is going to refer to that basically as economic coercion. Some of the terms are not the greatest terms for these countries with their loans and stuff. What could the G7 and the West do alternatively to compete with China's Belt and Road? I mean, if you're a country in South America that hasn't gotten a lot of attention from the U.S. or in Africa that hasn't gotten a lot of attention from the West, and here's China going, hey, I got some venture capital for you. Here are the terms. You understand why they want to take it. How can the West counter this?
Well, unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party has become a kind of a predator-creditor in the sense that what these other countries around the world are finding is that the terms often end up being very onerous.
Like going to a check cashing store? Like going to one of those check cashing stores, you end up with 18% interest on the VIG or whatever?
Exactly, and then you have to turn over the bridge or the port or the piece of infrastructure to the bank, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party. All that being said, Chuck, you're absolutely right. We have to offer an alternative. We have to make sure that these countries with very real needs are able to finance infrastructure projects using assistance from us. So working with our allies, with our friends, using the Development Finance Corporation, along with other authorities that Congress may need to provide to the executive branch and the president, we should be in a position where we can also offer, for instance, financing for a telecommunications network that doesn't rely on Huawei, for instance, or being able to help a country develop its roads and bridges without necessarily, giving it over to the Chinese Communist Party when they can't comply with the onerous
Congressman, this used to be what we did. Why did we lose our way? I mean, I don't mean to, everything we're describing, I mean, this is the Marshall Plan. This is what we did. This is how America built its power. A soft power, this is what we did. We really have let this lag this century, have we not?
That's exactly right. In fact, without boring all your viewers to tears, at one point we decided that we wanted to get out of the kind of loan assistance business because we feared that by offering too many loans to people that we would saddle them with debt. And then, as you might recall, 20 25 years ago, we decided that we would instead convert our assistance to grant assistance. The problem is that the grant assistance that we provided was fairly minimal in comparison to the needs, and certainly in comparison to what the Chinese Communist Party was offering. So at this point, we have to come up with a different model. Maybe it's not the loans that we were offering before, but maybe it's not the minimal equity or the grant assistance that we're offering right now. Maybe it's some public-private partnership concept, and also working with our allies and partners and friends.
Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi, Democrat from Illinois, the vice chair of the China Select Committee, along with Mike Gallagher. Appreciate you coming on, sharing your perspective with us. Thank you, sir. We'll be looking. We'll be watching tonight.
Yes,
Coming
sir.
up, about last night, Trump's pick wins in Kentucky. DeSantis's pick somehow comes in third. What it says about the political mojo and missteps of the two presidential contenders, plus a rare resignation. A Massachusetts U.S. attorney who's going to step down and could face criminal charges after a Justice Department investigation found she used her position to try and sway an election, basically pretend that somebody was going to be under investigation before an election. Then she lied under oath about it. That story ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. I missed that. Welcome back. We are awfully fond of saying if it's Tuesday, someone's voting somewhere, which means if it's Wednesday, we've got election results. A whole bunch of them for this Wednesday, actually. But we're going to start with the results out of Kentucky's Republican gubernatorial primary, because November's governor's race is shaping up to be the most consequential election of 2023. And last night's primary also had the added bonus of being turned into a last-minute proxy battle between Donald Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron won last night's Republican primary to take on a popular incumbent Democratic governor, Andy Beshear. That'll happen in November. The victorious Cameron was backed by Donald Trump, a rare instance of him and Mitch McConnell being on the same page, while Florida Governor Ron DeSantis somehow decided to weigh in the last minute to endorse Kelly Craft, who ended up coming in a distant third. And adding insult to political injury for Governor DeSantis, a Republican with his political backing also lost the mayoral race in his political home base of Jacksonville last night as well, giving Florida Democrats their first substantial victory since the red wave of last November. Dasha Burns has been on the ground in Kentucky for us. She's in Lexington with more on those races in Kentucky. And what's fascinating here, Dasha, is it wasn't really close, and yet there was so much money thrown into this Republican primary here. And Cameron was the front runner when this race started, arguably 3.5 years ago, and he's the nominee today.
Yeah, a lot of money thrown into this race, and mostly by Cameron's opponents, and he absolutely ran away with it. Look, there were a lot of questions that we were coming into this race with from a national perspective as well as for the state of Kentucky. This is so consequential because it really is a bellwether race, Chuck, in 2023, looking ahead to 2024 about really what wins out with voters here, what wins out for Republican voters, and what wins out in this general election. Initially, we were coming in wondering, is it the Trump endorsement that's going to win, or is it Trumpism? Because Kelly Craft, while not endorsed by the former president, was certainly touting her ties. She was the UN ambassador during his administration and was kind of doing the Trump style of campaigning, really leaning into the culture war stuff. But in the end, she did end up snagging that endorsement from Governor Ron DeSantis. That came in very last minute in the 11th hour, coming in on Monday night, and an odd decision for him to do that. I mean, look, she did kind of play in his style as well with the, the sort of wokeism terminology that she was using a lot, but kind of an odd choice. If you want to be a kingmaker, if you want to show the power of your endorsement to hitch your wagon to that horse, not the right choice there. And last night, Cameron did kind of take a little bit of a dig at Governor DeSantis in his victory speech. Take a listen.
Of course, a big thank you to President Donald J. Trump for his support and his endorsement of this campaign. Let me just say, the Trump culture of winning is alive and well in Kentucky.
Of course, not mentioning DeSantis by name, but that line, culture of winning, a reference to a line that DeSantis has been using during his speeches lately, saying that Republicans need to move away from a culture of losing, referencing Donald Trump, of course, not by name, but implicitly with that line, Chuck.
Well, it is worth noting that the person who ran the Trumpiest campaign didn't win, and the Secretary of State, the incumbent Republican, knocked off a couple of election deniers in the primary, too. So of interesting decisions by the Republican electorate in Kentucky last night. Dasha Burns in Lexington for us. Dasha, thank you. So for more on all of this, let me bring in today's panel. Meredith McGraw is a national political correspondent for Politico. And we have a couple former members of Congress, former Alabama Democratic Senator Doug Jones and former Florida Republican Congressman Carlos Curbelo, who's, of course, an NBC News political analyst. Meredith, I'm going to put up something here. I'm obsessed with Kentucky governor because look at this track record in the 21st century. The party that wins Kentucky governor seems to foreshadow the party that wins the presidency. It's been 100% accurate this century. We've got a nice little graphic here to prove this, starting in 2003. And each time it has been a fascinating barometer, sort of in the reverse of the Virginia post-presidential streak. I think it's 8 of the last 9 down there. And I find Andy Beshear, he ran against a Trump-like figure 4 years ago, ran the Biden campaign. Biden sort of, there is some synergy here.
Yeah, and, you know, he might be the one to break the mold. He continues to be popular in the state of Kentucky, even though Donald Trump won the state by 26 points. It's a ruby red state, and I know a lot of Republicans are salivating over that governor's seat and will be closely watching this race with Daniel Cameron, who's seen as a rising star in the party, who got Trump's endorsement and, you know, like you said, has the rare quality of being backed by both McConnell and Trump.
Carlos, I would assume, as a Republican who's sort of more in the center of the Republican Party rather than, you know, you've got to be pleased with what the Kentucky Republican electorate. This felt like very normal Republicans that won, with normal Republican messaging.
Sure,
Trump messaging.
It was a good night for Trump, but I think it was an even better night for Mitch McConnell. And we know that Mitch McConnell's kind of the last guy standing when you're talking about the Republican establishment.
Yeah.
So not only did his candidate for governor win, which Trump also endorsed, but the Secretary of State, which fought off the election deniers, which we know is a big issue for McConnell, that too. So, it does give people a little bit of hope that perhaps there's a course correction going on in the party here, much needed.
Yeah. Doug Jones, what's your, you and Andy Beshear, I mean, you've sort of done this race. You've won a race like this, you've lost a race like this.
Yeah.
How do you win it, and how do you
look, I think Andy Beshear has done an incredible job as governor of Kentucky, and people are going to recognize that. Folks in the South, there is a partisanship, there is that tribalism that goes on, but at the same time, they want somebody that's on the ground working for them, and that is somebody that they have seen. I think the Attorney General, Mr. Cameron, is going to have a very difficult time as a prosecutor explaining the endorsement of somebody who is under indictment and under investigation. I think there's a long way to go in this race, but I feel really good about where Andy Beshear is in the race.
Well, I'll just tell you, I mean, Beshear Cameron, I think this is going to be a marquee race, no matter what.
For sure.
This would have been a marquee if it was in an even-numbered year. Meredith, I want to talk about the DeSantis-Trump back and forth here, but I want to do it because there's been an interesting back and forth on abortion. I want to play something that DeSantis said about Trump on where he stands on abortion. Let me play it.
I think that as a Florida resident, he didn't give an answer about would you have signed the heartbeat bill that Florida did. They had all the exceptions that people talk about. The legislature put it in. I signed the bill. I was proud to do it. He won't answer whether he would sign it or not.
I find this fascinating for a number of reasons. It signals where he wants to go in this primary. Now, Donald Trump responded on his personal social media site, Truth Social, and he said this: I was able to kill Roe v. Wade, much to the shock of everyone, and for the first time put the pro-life movement in a strong negotiating position. Without me, there would be no 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 15 weeks, or whatever is finally agreed to. Without me, the pro-life movement would have just kept losing. I find it, Trump's trying to moderate himself, and DeSantis, I guess he's borrowing the Ted Cruz strategy, trying to run to his right. It didn't work for Cruz 8 years ago. I don't know if it works now.
Well, he's, certainly putting his foot down that he's going to stand behind the 6 weeks bill.
He's going to own this.
He's going to own this. And that's something that initially people were questioning when he signed it. It was kind of done in a quiet way, whether or not he was really going to campaign on this. Meanwhile, Trump has been a little bit all over the map when it comes to abortion, claiming that he's the king of the pro-life movement. He's responsible for the toppling
Isn't
of
he right, though?
He is.
I mean, isn't this an interesting retort? Like, he still didn't take a position.
And yet he's saying he can also take credit for, like you said, 6 weeks, 15 weeks, wherever a state or a candidate might fall, he can take credit for some of that.
I mean, Trump's ability not to take a position sometimes is an asset, and this it might be.
Well, Chuck, what's happening is fascinating. Ron DeSantis is running in the Republican primary. Donald Trump is running in the general election.
He's already thinking about the
general. He is looking past the primary, and for someone who has so many issues, God knows if he even makes it that far, right? Because he's got a bunch of legal challenges that he's going to have to clear before that. But he is so confident that he's got this Republican nomination under his belt that he can ignore Ron DeSantis and say things like, I'm willing to negotiate on abortion. And by the way, I don't think DeSantis is going to be able to convince the Republican electorate that Trump wasn't good on abortion because he does have that Trump card, which is the Roe v. Wade decision.
A year ago, Doug, would you have thought DeSantis was going to be a harder matchup than Trump for Biden? Would you have assumed that? And do you still assume that?
Yeah, no, I probably still assume that.
But this 6-week abortion ban feels like I just can't imagine any nominee successfully pulling this off with that. And that it just is surprising.
No, I agree with that. I think a year ago I would have certainly said that. Today, less or so, because I think we've seen DeSantis running so far to the right. And he is running away from middle America. He is running away from those independents and those moderate Republicans to some extent. You don't pick a fight with Tinkerbell the way he did, and the culture war and the cancel culture that he's engaged in. That's not where I think people are. So I think he'd still be tough to win. It's going to be a rough election.
Meredith, a lot of people pointed out this odd Kelly Craft endorsement at the last minute. That DeSantis and Kelly Craft share a political consultant in common who works for the super PAC. Kelly Craft's husband is extraordinarily wealthy and writes a lot of 7- and 8-figure checks. It's about the only explanation you can come up with.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk of this is going to be this Trump versus DeSantis endorsement proxy battle. I really didn't see it that way at all. DeSantis came in really at the last minute and in such an odd way. It was a robocall that at first some of the reporters who were forwarded this robocall, we were questioning if it was legitimate or not.
Sure.
Yeah, and
in the age of AI, we're all like
right.
And
the Kraft campaign, they confirmed it. But as you said, it was very last minute. It came in the form of a robocall just a few days before. And, it was sort of similar to, it was very last minute. And it's important to point out that they do share consultants.
Yeah, Carlos Curbelo, what I can't figure out is he getting bad advice or does he have bad instincts? And I thought this was a guy who had really good instincts.
Look, he is trying to professionalize his campaign. He has not been taking advice for a long time. It seems like that is going to start changing. And, this issue that Doug brought up about electability in a general, I think is a real concern. Duval County, DeSantis.
How big of a deal do you think the Jacksonville mayor's race is?
Well, it's a deal. I don't know if it's a huge deal, but
enough.
that's DeSantis' home turf.
It isn't a nothing burger.
I mean, DeSantis romped there in November. Yeah. But since then, all these new policies, the fight with Disney, 6-week abortion ban, open carry. You can imagine that had an impact with some swing voters in Jacksonville.
And Duval is nothing but swing voters.
Right, exactly.
It is one of these interesting, almost suburban-like
cities.
In
a way, it's the new battleground. It used to be the I-4 corridor. Yeah. Now it's the Northeast.
Joe Biden and how he's going about this. Does the messaging change if DeSantis is the opponent rather than Trump?
I don't think so. I don't think it should. First of all, back to this proxy issue real quick. I think DeSantis has to understand he may have some popularity. He doesn't have a following. And that's a big difference when you're starting endorsements around the country. He just doesn't have that yet. But I don't think the messaging changes at all. Joe Biden's message is success. His experience and success over the last 2 years. And what is going to be interesting is that more people are going to be feeling that success over the next year and a half. They're going to be feeling the $35 insulin cost and watching the bridges go up, watching the roads being prepared.
One of our pollsters reminded us of a quote Bob Dole said about his 1980 presidential campaign. He goes, he ran because he thought voters wanted a younger Reagan And he said, it turns out they just wanted Reagan. And DeSantis is, got this theory, they want a Trump with no drama. And it's like, they might just want Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of people like the drama.
Yeah. And Meredith, thank you all. Before we go to break, I wanted to note the results from another election last night we didn't get to in Philadelphia, where Sherelle Parker is now likely on her way to be the city's first ever female mayor. After winning the Democratic primary last night, the former city council member and state representative was part of a very crowded primary field that included former city council member Helen Jim, who was endorsed by progressive lawmakers like Senator Bernie Sanders, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. And like we've seen in other big city mayoral contests, including New York and Chicago, crime was a key issue in this race. Parker ran on a more tough-on-crime platform, even signaling support for stop-and-frisk rules. Philadelphia is a Democratic Party stronghold, so Parker's primary victory last night means she is now poised to become the city's 100th mayor when the general election is held in November. Basically, if you're trying to say which side of the mayoral aisle is she on, she's probably closer to an Eric Adams than she is to a Karen Bass or a Brandon Johnson of Chicago. Up next, we're going to go live to North Carolina, the latest state to roll back access to abortion, despite the governor's efforts to veto it. The fallout next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. North Carolina Republicans took advantage of their veto-proof majority last night, overriding a veto by the state's Democratic governor to enact a 12-week abortion ban. Both the Senate and House voted along party lines, including now Republican State Representative Tricia Cotham, who switched her party affiliation last month, and that's what gave the supermajority to the GOP to allow this to happen. The new law bans abortion after 12 weeks. There's a 20-week exception for rape and incest and a 24-week exception for life-limiting fetal abnormalities. The law also requires a person seeking an abortion in that first 12 weeks to have an in-person visit with a doctor at least 72 hours before undergoing the procedure. So even within that 12-week period, it's some strict provisions to it. Some of the provisions of this new law, including that 12-week ban, are set to take effect as soon as July 1st. Now, the move in North Carolina comes as the debate over access to the abortion pill, mifepristone, is also back in court today. The panel of Republican-appointed judges on the Fifth Circuit heard arguments in the case this afternoon. Their ruling on the nationwide availability of the pill could come down at any time. But honestly, regardless of how this court rules, the case is likely to be appealed to the Supreme Court, unless for some reason this Fifth Circuit rules in the same way that Washington State's that district court judge from Washington State ruled. But that is unlikely. Shaquille Brewster joins us now from Raleigh, North Carolina. And Shaq, this is happening, and it feels like it's basically the beginning of the 2024 campaign in the Tar Heel state, because everything is on the ballot in 2024. The governor, the state legislature, the presidency, you name it.
That's exactly right, Chuck, and that kind of gives you a sense of why Governor Cooper was so aggressive, and after vetoing this legislation, going to the districts of Republican legislators, trying to convince them to flip their vote. Because although he knew they likely wouldn't change their vote, he knows that this is going to be a political, on the political battleground from this point forward. North Carolina now shifting to that 12-week ban, but if you talk to opponents, that number is just is a little bit misleading because of the other provisions of the legislation that really change how abortions are done throughout the state. Chuck, I spoke to the Speaker of the House, the Republican Speaker of the North Carolina House of Representatives, about the changes in this law. Just listen to a little bit of our conversations, because it doesn't only reflect on what has been done so far, but it gives you a hint of what will happen in the future.
There were certainly a lot on my side of the aisle who felt like a 6-week bill, like it's being debated in South Carolina, other states, would be more appropriate. And then, of course, there's some that wanted more weeks than 12. And so the compromise came down to 12 weeks, but also made sure that we had those exceptions in there as well. So that's the bill that we passed.
You call this a compromise. Do you think that there's any future legislation to come here? Do you think that it can be restricted even more than 12 weeks?
So what I will say is that for this legislative session, meaning this calendar year and next calendar year, this will be all the legislation that we adopt on this topic.
Do you know what happens at the end of next calendar year? Well, that is when there will be a new governor elected in this state, perhaps leading to the idea that if there is a Republican who's elected as governor, then the supermajority is no longer a factor, and that means you could have some more restrictions similar to what you're seeing South Carolina try to debate right now with the six-week abortion ban. So more is potentially to come once the actual veto goes away.
And we also have the fact that I believe they're going to be redrawing the map, potentially, right? There could be a new map for all, not just congressional boundaries, but for the state legislature, too, which could also... Look, there's going to be some Republicans who voted for this who are going to be vulnerable, and I would assume the map drawers are trying to figure that out as well. I mean, this is what makes it feel like quite the convergence of sort of political fire here.
Absolutely. And, you know, one thing with the new maps, I mean, I talked to the speaker about this. The governor doesn't necessarily have a veto with that. I mean, just if you step back, the idea that this is a state with a Democratic governor, but a supermajority in the legislature, that just shows you the imbalance of power there, the how the maps really work out and what that looks like electorally. I will say also, in terms of the supermajority that Republicans now have in this state, Democrats are pointing out that this may just be the beginning, that there are other issues that will come up while redistricting is not one of them. Things like transgender rights, education reform, those are things that can come before this legislature and now be enacted despite the governor issuing his veto.
Well, North Carolina is one of those strange, evenly divided states. There's not many swing voters. There's just a very evenly divided red and blue at times, and it is a small, tiny slice of voters that can tip the scales one way or the other. Anyway, Shaquille Brewster on the ground for us in North Carolina. Shaq, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. After the break, we have the latest on a scandal facing the Massachusetts U.S. Attorney's Office. It is evidence of an attempt to politicize that U.S. Attorney's Office. That's next. You're watching Meet the President. Welcome back. We're now going to turn to a shakeup inside the Justice Department amid reports of misconduct and attempts to meddle in an election. The U.S. Attorney in Massachusetts, Rachel Rollins, announced her resignation after the Justice Department's Inspector General issued a scathing report today saying she used her position to try to help a candidate in the race for district attorney and then lied about it when confronted by investigators. At the same time, a separate government office, which is the Office of Special Counsel, released its own report that accused Rollins of breaking the law by leaking sensitive Justice Department information. Our own Justice Department correspondent, Ken Delaney, joins me now to break down the findings. I mean, the most alarming thing when I was reading this report, Ken, so basically this U.S. attorney got meddled in a primary for the DA, hinting that maybe there might be a federal investigation of one of the candidates. I mean, that is the weaponization of that office.
100%. Look, U.S. attorneys are some of the most powerful federal officials in the government, and you rarely see a scandal involving a U.S. attorney. This one's a doozy. These are some of the most scathing reports I've ever seen from these offices. The Inspector General, on the one hand, and then the Office of Special Counsel, which investigates Hatch Act violations. They both looked at the same conduct, and they found that she abused her office, as you said, to try to plant a story, essentially, in the press, suggesting that the Justice Department was investigating, essentially, her political enemy. And then there were other things, too. I mean, she's accused of, and they found that she attended a Democratic fundraiser featuring Jill Biden, the First Lady, even though her ethics officers told her she can't do it because it's a violation of the Hatch Act. Wow. And she accepted some free tickets to a Boston Celtics game and some other stuff. The Office of Special Counsel said it was some of the most egregious violations of the Hatch Act he had ever seen.
How well known were these ethical violations before today? Like, did folks in did she have a reputation inside the Justice Department?
She did. She had a reputation in law enforcement circles, but what was most known about, because it was reported, was the attendance at the Biden fundraiser, at the Democratic fundraiser. But she tweeted at the time that she had permission to do it. That wasn't true. And then when they started looking, they learned people clearly made complaints from inside the office.
I was just going to say, this has all the, assistant U.S. attorneys are the career people, right? Yeah. They call AUSAs.
That's right.
Right? Most of them are sort of what I call, they're the true believers, right? Meaning they're going to get justice wherever it takes them. They're the real true believers. The U.S. attorney is always the political head, right?
Exactly. And she was the former DA in Boston. Mm-hmm. She's a politician, but many U.S. attorneys are politicians.
Many of them are.
But they are vetted by the Senate, and who are usually very careful about who they put in these jobs. And in this case, obviously, people made a mistake.
Very quickly, while I have you here, the Durham report, it's out. Do we think we're going to hear from Durham himself before he testifies on the Hill? I mean, does he speak to media? I mean, he's keeping a pretty low profile.
He has historically not spoken to media. Boy, I sure would love to hear from him and hear his thoughts on this remarkable report. I
have a few programs he could appear on.
There you go. I hope he takes you up on it. I mean, the general consensus among people who've been following this is that report was a bit of a dud, that he didn't even go as far as he had in other settings in arguing that the FBI shouldn't have opened that Russia investigation.
Right. But there is a larger problem here, the perception of the FBI. I mean, this was an FBI that, got overly involved. Comey got overly involved in both cases. That, to me, is the real takeaway here. This was Comey, and in his own bizarre way, maybe was trying to balance things out.
And the result is that half the country is very suspicious of the FBI, and that's a problem.
I think the whole country is now.
It's a problem for FBI agents going into court on bank robberies, for example.
100%. Ken Delaney, thank you, sir. Still to come, AI, space exploration, and the Princess Bride. Who, by chance, could I be talking about? We're going to break down one of the most intriguing interviews you'll ever see when billionaire Tesla founder and outgoing Twitter CEO Elon Musk sat down for an exclusive interview with CNBC's David Faber. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. It has now been nearly 7 months since Elon Musk officially bought Twitter, and less than a week since he named a successor as CEO. But the founder of Tesla and SpaceX does not appear to be shying away from controversies surrounding his tweets and various public comments. In a wide-ranging interview with CNBC's David Faber, Musk defended his remarks and opinions and says he will continue to be outspoken regardless of the toll it takes on his businesses.
Do your tweets hurt the company? Are there Tesla owners who say, I don't agree with his political position and I know it because he shares so much of it?
You know, I'm reminded of the scene in The Princess Bride. Great movie.
Great movie.
Where he confronts the person who killed his father. And he says, offer me money. Offer me power. I don't care.
So you just don't care. You want to share what you have to say.
I'll say what I want to say, and if the consequence of that is losing money, so be it.
And David Faber joins me now. And David, I'm sensitive. I'm never crazy about being asked to characterize interviews I conduct, and I'm sensitive to that here, David. But I'm curious, have you interviewed him before? Have you interviewed him before?
Never. No,
okay.
No,
so this is your first interaction with him. To me, it's not surprising when somebody as successful and wealthy as he is saying, I don't care, right? They have, I think in their mind, they have the bank account to say, well, I don't care. Do you think that's true, or do you think he's just saying it?
I don't know, to be honest. He's so influential. He's so important in the business world. I mean, there's no getting around that. I find it hard to imagine he can't understand the impact that so many of these tweets have, because he typically does latch on to things that are sometimes distasteful, sometimes just wrong. It's behavior, though, that he doesn't want to stop. You know, he says he's a free speech absolutist, and he seems to mean it, at least when it comes to what he has to say.
You know, it's interesting. How does he have the time? He's extraordinarily online. I just sit here, there's certain senators, and I always sit there and you're like, oh, man, this is their full-time job, is to be online. And yet, Elon Musk is also designing rockets and designing cars, and I really, there's no doubt if he's not in the room, stuff doesn't get done. I'm just surprised at how much this is not a distraction.
I agree with you. I don't know exactly. Obviously, I asked him. He works 7 days a week.
Yeah.
Took 3 days off last year. Does sleep 6 hours a night, more than I thought he might.
Yeah.
But he does spend a lot of time on that phone, on Twitter.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. He sees it as a communication platform, clearly. He's obviously very able to get his views across or anything else he wants. But you're right. This is the most consequential businessman on the planet. Launching rockets into space, the largest EV maker by far, and yet he does dedicate his most important resource, his time, to this.
Very quickly, is there another CEO in history you would compare him to? Or is he unlike anybody else we've ever seen in the business world?
There's nobody that close. I mean, Jobs was certainly interesting, incredibly influential, but this guy is unique. And no handlers, no PR people, nothing, Todd, just him.
So I've heard, which is why booking him, fantastic. That to me is the win, David. I am jealous, and I am not afraid to admit it. David Faber, great stuff. It was quite the interview. I digested the entire thing. Thanks for being with us this hour. I'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Tom Costello, who's sitting in for Hallie Jackson, and it begins right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.